configuring your ASP.NET applications for Microsoft OAuth account. So you want to enable a login mechanism using Microsoft's OAuth account in your ASP.NET application. So that's what this video is all about. We'll go through the steps involved and then take each step closer look, and then we'll finish this particular setting. So the steps involved in as part of this particular process is, first we create an ASP.NET web application. We'll use a test domain, well, for the development time only, that is doing development. We'll use a test domain because Microsoft OAuth account requires a live domain to redirect back from the the login process. That is, you go to Microsoft's OAuth server, user enters his user ID and password. Once he's authenticated, the Microsoft's OAuth server will try to redirect the request to the domain, to the application, and then it requires an actual domain, so it won't redirect to a local host. That's why we're going to be using a test domain. Next, we will edit the firewall settings on your system. This is only on a dev machine, to make sure we work seamlessly with the OAuth server and then your localhost mapping. So we'll do a firewall setting on port 80 to allow external requests to be allowed. Then we'll go to configure the Microsoft Live portal. Basically, you will need to go register an application on the Microsoft Live portal, get a client ID and client secret, which is required for your web application. Then we'll use those keys in our application. We'll need to enable the Microsoft's OAuth login mechanism in the ASP.NET web application. For that, we'll require these keys. Without these keys, Microsoft OAuth server will not authenticate you. Then we map the test domain that we created to our application. We'll be running on IS Express, and then since it's an IS Express and I'll have a test domain, I'll need to let IS Express know that, hey, whenever somebody is coming from a particular domain, it should map to this particular localhost port number on which my application is running. So we'll do that mapping, and then we run the app, and then hope everything works out very well. The first step in this particular process is to create a new ASP.NET application. So let's go ahead and create a file new ASP.NET web application. I'm using Visual Studio Ultimate 2013. You can use any version of Visual Studio to go ahead with the following process. As a customary thing, I'm going to say file new project and web, select ASP.NET web application, and maybe give it the name of Web App Microsoft OAuth. So let me remove this. So I'm going to name this as Web App Microsoft OAuth. Give it a full location. I'm going to say OK, and then I'm going to select Web Forms. For this example, it doesn't matter whether you select web forms or MVC. Basically, what we're going to be looking at is the authentication piece. So both web forms and MVC now use the same authentication mechanism, so doesn't matter. I'm going to select web form just to keep it simple. The authentication is going to be individual user accounts, and I'm going to say OK. Visual Studio will go ahead and then create the web application for me. And we see that Visual Studio has completed creating this web application. As you can see, it gives me a nice README. If I look at my Solution Explorer, typical web application project structure, we have the account where it has all the ASPX pages required to register, login, everything. And then I have the app start, and then startup.auth is provided, and this is where pretty much we'll come back and then enable this particular following section. As you can see here is the code block required to enable Microsoft OAuth account authentication, or Twitter or Facebook or Google or any OAuth for that matter. So I'm going to be coming back here and then enabling the Microsoft account authentication thing. Then we have the global.asax in place. Everything else is in place. So let's quickly run this and make sure it is working as expected, which it will be. So let me run this. And we have Internet Explorer coming up, and we see the traditional ASP.NET start page where you have home, and then you have the about, then you have the contact, of course we have the login. So this is where we're going to be enabling, as you can see on the right hand side, this is where we will be enabling an external authentication service to be configured. And then today we're going to, in this video, we are looking at Microsoft OAuth account. This is for the local account login, and I will enable here a particular button which says Microsoft, so that users can come in instead of logging in with the local ID. They can actually go to Microsoft, use their Microsoft Live account, authenticate, and then come back, and then my application will pretty much respect that, and then let him come in, and then he's going to be authenticated. So let me close this, and we'll come back again to this particular application in a next step. The second step is to make sure we use a test domain. This is because when we transfer our request from our localhost application to Microsoft account, OAuth account, in order to authenticate, Microsoft OAuth server, what it does is it will finish it at authentication, and then it has to redirect back to the application which actually called for the authentication mechanism. So in our case, when we are doing our development, during the development time, we will be pretty much under the localhost colon a port number, because we are running under the IS Express, and then IS Express sets up a port, and then you use the localhost domain. So in the Microsoft OAuth server, you have to set up a redirect URL, and then that redirect URL cannot be a localhost colon port number. What the Microsoft OAuth server expects is a full-fledged live domain that it requires. So in a production system, you always have your own domain, like for example, www.yourapplication.com. So you will have the domain, but now when I'm doing my development, I have just localhost, and I cannot make sure that the OAuth server from Microsoft will redirect to localhost. It will just say invalid redirect URI. In order to overcome this, what we can do is some good folks at localtest.me, they have created this particular website called localtest.me, wherein if you go and then put any a domain, it redirects back to localhost. So let's quickly take a look at this localhost.me. Let me bring up a Internet Explorer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just say localtest.me, and if you see here, it always goes to it is going to my localhost. In fact, this is actually my IAS server being served. So 127.0.0.1 is what is being served now. If I go to readme.localtest.me, this pretty much says what this whole thing is all about. So localhost testing done right. So that's the intent of this particular site. So if you see there, star.localtest.me will redirect you back to your 127.0.0.1. So basically, whenever we are in a situation where some redirect URI cannot be put as a localhost colon port number, what we can do is we can always use this localtest.me website, and then now what they're saying is and then anything star.localtest.me will be redirected back to your local host, so 127.0.0.1. So for my example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say Kashyapa foo.localtest.me. Let me copy this because I need this for my future setup. So I'm going to just say Kashyapa foo.localtest.me, and then I click this, and you can see that this particular URL is actually a valid domain. Kashyapa foo.localtest.me is a valid URI, valid domain, and the Microsoft OAuth server will not have any problem using this as a redirect URI. But when it does that, it is being redirected back to my local host, which is 127.0.0.1, and we are seeing the IAS welcome page. So that's what we'll be using. I know that's what this step is all about, making sure that you understand this local test domain that we will need for the next step. Step number 3 is to make sure that our firewall rules within my development machine is set up to enable an external request on port 80 coming into my local host URI. So this is required because the Microsoft Word server will try to redirect back to a local host application running on a dev machine. And then although in the step 2 we have set up the test domain will point back to a localhost colon port number. So we need to make sure that our firewall rules within my dev machine is set up to allow that particular rule. So in this step, we're going to go through how to set up that firewall rule for port 80. Open up your control panel from the start menu and then get into Windows Firewall. Once you open control panel, then you don't see a Windows Firewall, don't worry. Just go to this view by category and then say large icon, and then we should be able to see this particular category or icon called as Windows Firewall. So click on that Windows Firewall, let the Windows Firewall come up, and then on the left hand side there is this advanced setting. Click on advanced setting, and you should see another dialog or another window open up which says Windows Firewall and with advanced security. And then in this particular dialog box, select the inbound rules, and here we're going to create a new inbound rule for port 80. So click on the new rule that's available on the right hand side actions pane. If you see here, there is a new rule, so click on new rule. We'll get a new inbound rule wizard. So what we need to do here is we need to select the port because we need to set a rule for port 80. So select the port as the option here. Click on next, and then leave the TCP as is. And then if you see here, there are two options which says all local ports are specific local ports. In our case, we are looking for a very specific port, and that is 80. And then set 80 and then say next, and then say keep the default as is. It says allow the connection, so keep the allow connection as is. Click on next and let the defaults be as is, so domain, private and public. So it's basically saying, like, should it be applied within the domain or private network or public network. So I'm going to keep it same and then leave it. So we need to give it a name for this rule just for us to identify in the background. If you see there are a lot many rules available. So just to make sure we understand this is our rule, so we can say HTTP 80 MS OAuth. I'm just going to say MS OAuth test, and let me make it 80 and click on finish. So we'll see, like, our rule is now coming up here. So that's this step is all about creating a new rule for the port 80 so that the external request can be allowed into this system. Next up, we will need to configure our application in Microsoft's Live Portal. Basically, if you want to use the Microsoft's OAuth server in order to for the authentication mechanism, you will need to first register your web application under the Microsoft Live Portal and get a client ID and client secret generated for that. And you will use that client ID and client secret in your web application, so that whenever there is a scenario wherein user clicks on a button called Microsoft and then we head over to the Microsoft OAuth server, the Microsoft's OAuth server will actually validate that this is a registered application which is requesting for the OAuth authentication mechanism, and then only it will do the further steps, that is providing the login screen and then let the user enter his user ID and password. Without configuring your application or without registering your application with the Live Portal, you'll not be able to make use of the OAuth server. So next, let's see how we configure the MS Live Portal. In order to register our application, we will need to head over to developer portal of Microsoft Live. So I'm going to account.live.com/developers/application/index. I'm already logged in. As you can see here, it knows who I am. So you may need to provide your live credentials before just coming into this particular page. That's the My Applications page. So make sure you enter your live credentials and then come back here. So here we have the create application link. I'm going to click on that, and in order to just give an application name, I'm going to say Web App, MS Login, just any name that you can provide for your app. And here, if you see here, it says if you want to provide any additional information like the logo, the terms of service URL, privacy URL, you can pretty much add it here. But for now, I'm going to just click on save because I'm just doing my testing. I will go to API settings, and it is asking me if it's a mobile or a desktop client. No, mine is a web app, so I'm going to just leave it as is. Target domain, I will leave it as is. The restrict jQuery web token, I will say yes. I'll leave it as is. Now here is where the local test.me domain that we had created or we had tested comes into picture. So we will have to provide here the redirect URL equal to that whatever I had created earlier. So that's http kashyapafoo.localtest.me, and we will need to make sure that we add this particular end trailing words here, so that this is the kind of a path that is sign in hyphen Microsoft. This is very important to make sure you provide this. So what I'm doing is I'm saying like, hey, once you finish your authentication at your end on the Microsoft Word server, you please redirect to kashyapafoo.localtest.me/sign in hyphen Microsoft. Don't worry, this is just a fictitious URL or a virtual URL. The code in the ASP.NET application knows how to look for this particular redirection and then take over and then get on with our application. So don't worry, we just need to put this particular trailing path as is and then click on save. So now it's been saved. We go to app settings, and if you can see here, I have the client ID and then I have the client secret provided here. So we'll need to remember this particular client ID and client secret because we'll need this to be added up to our web application. So I'm going to go ahead and then make a note of these two. I'm pasting it to my notepad so that when we get into our ASP.NET web application, we can pretty much go and then paste this to the code block in the startup config, and then we'll be done with that particular setting. So now we are finished with registering our application in the MS Live portal. Let's get on to the next step. Step number 5 is all about configuring the client keys we just created in previous step in the Microsoft Live portal in the web application. So we will need to copy those client keys and then add them in our startup auth config in the web application. So let's get on with that, and then we'll add the client keys. I'm back in my Visual Studio, and then I've opened up startup.auth.cs, and then as you can see here, the commented line here, we will need to uncomment this. It says uncomment the following lines to enable logging in with third-party login providers. So I'm going to enable or uncomment this particular lines which says use Microsoft account authentication. So we need to provide the client ID we just created in the previous step. I've already made a note of that, so I'm going to paste it here. So let me get the client secret, and I'm gonna say save. Now let's see what's the effect of adding this particular line. So let me start the project. I'm gonna run the project. So we'll go to localhost :62903, and if I go to register, not register, let's go to login. So if you go to login, basically you will see like now it says, hey, use another service to log in, and then I get a nice Microsoft button here. So if I click, I will be redirected to Microsoft's live login, and then it goes to, if you see here, it's going there. So let's come back to that. This is what the effect of enabling that particular two lines is all about. So it gives me this external service provider, login provider called Microsoft. Let me close this, and we need to do one more thing, and that's in the next step we're gonna enable redirection to our local domain using the local test.me domain that we have created. So let's get on with that next step. Step number 6, we will need to map the test domain that we had created at localtest.me to our localhost application. So let's see how to do this mapping. Our web application in Visual Studio is actually running under the hood on a IIS Express, so we will need to set up certain configurational things for the mapping inside the IIS Express config file. So head over to your documents, and in front of the documents you should see IIS Express folder. In IIS Express folder we have the config file, and then open up the config file, which is the application host.config. So I'm going to right click and then say open in Sublime. Sublime is a text editor, so you can open in any text editor of your choice. So let me close everything else. Now here we will need to find the entry for our particular web application. So let me bring up my web application. So what did we say? We said web app Microsoft OAuth. So let me search for Microsoft web app, sorry, web app Microsoft OAuth. So here's where we have the entry for our application we just created. So this is the IIS Express config file, and then this is how IIS Express maintains all the sites that you create, or the web apps that you create. So it says site name web app Microsoft OAuth, and let me close the search window. So this is what we have. So it says application path, it knows where my physical path is, and then take a look at this binding. It says binding protocol HTTP binding information. This is how it is mapped to a particular port number, localhost 62903. So here what we will do is we'll pretty much add a new binding protocol for port 80, and then let it know that, hey, if anybody comes from a very particular domain called kashyapafoo.localtest.me on a port 80, you need to redirect them to, or pretty much, you open up this particular web application. That's the binding is all about. So let me go ahead and copy this line, paste it again, and I will say instead of star colon 62903, I will say this is 80. Instead of localhost, I will say kashyapa foo.localtest.me. Let's go with this once again. So all I'm saying is I'm providing another binding here. Instead of this localhost colon 62903, if somebody comes on port 80 from a domain called kashyapafoo.localtest.me, I want you to please serve this particular localhost 62903. So that's just a binding, because what happens is the Microsoft OAuth server will actually redirect back to kashyapafoo.localtest.me/signin hyphen Microsoft. So that's when our application has to catch that particular redirection and then do whatever it has to do. So now what we'll need to do is we'll need to restart the IIS, and we'll need to relaunch the website. Basically what we can do is on the tray you will have the IIS Express, just restart it, or you can even pretty much close. So let me first save this and then close this, and then what we'll do is if I just close my Visual Studio, the IIS Express would be like in a way restarted. So let me get back my Visual Studio, or in fact let me launch this Visual Studio as an admin mode. Let me just give me a second, and I'm now launching my Visual Studio in an admin mode. So you can pretty much do the same thing, right click, shift right click, and then run as administrator. So now as you can see here, I'm running my Visual Studio in administrator. For this particular redirection to work, you will need to be in admin mode inside your Visual Studio. That is basically, IIS Express is elevated. Now let's open a let me open the project first, web app Microsoft OAuth. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this. So let's give Visual Studio its time to load up. So now I'm clicking on F5, so I'm running the application. So I have the application coming up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up another. So this is going to localhost colon 62903. As you can see, I got it. So now see what happens with the redirection. So I will say kashyap foo.localtest.me, and voila, So what did happen? So basically we have remapped this particular domain, which is kashyapa.foo.localtest.me, to actually serve the pages from localhost colon 62903. So now let's go ahead and then execute this whole use case. That is, I want to log in using my Microsoft OAuth account. Now that I have the web application served through the localtest.me, I'm going to get into the login screen. So here's our login screen, and then as you can see here, we have the use another service to log in coming up here. So we have the traditional local login also available here. So now I can go in and then click on this Microsoft button, and this should take me to the Microsoft login provider. So now we are going to the Microsoft OAuth provider. So it's asking me, hey, I know who you are, but can you authenticate yourself by adding your password? So I've added that. Now I'm clicking on sign in. So it did everything. In fact, in my practice, I have already given consent to this particular app to take my email address and all those things. So if you are doing it for the first time, you will see a consent screen coming up. It will, the Microsoft OAuth server will say like, hey, this particular web application called as MS Web App Microsoft OAuth is trying to read your email address. You would have to say allow. So I've already done that. So now what is happening is I have been successfully authenticated on the Microsoft OAuth server, but when it comes to our application, which is the localhost based application, it says, hey, you have been authenticated with Microsoft, but can you enter an email below for the current site, and click the login button. So I'm going to say my login is kashyapa78@hotmail.com. So this is a typical of this particular flow. So although you are getting authenticated in an external service provider, but still the current application in question needs to know who you are. So it needs at least one identity of yours within the application, and in this case we are taking the email. So I'm going to say login. So now what should happen is, it should authenticate myself. As you can see here, hello kashyapa78@hotmail.com. And if I click on this particular manage account, it says password create. That's because I do not have a local credential. So I have not created a password locally. But if you see the external logins, it says one, and I have a manage button here. I can click on the manage. It says registered login Microsoft, use another service to log in. Anyway, I have not enabled anything else. I can in fact log off. So now again log back in, and when I'm logging back in, I can say Microsoft, and it will again ask me, hey, can you authenticate yourself? I'll say sign in. And there you go, we are done. So now what we did was we enabled our ASP.NET application to be able to rely on the third-party provider, login providers such as Microsoft OAuth, and then authenticate the user there, come back here, and then use the tokens and everything, and then everything is done by the library which is already there in your application. All you need to do is set it up. So this video was all about making sure you understand how to do this particular setups. There's a lot of so we just saw step number 7, which is F5, run the app. So I finished